Steve paced the room indignantly and threw angrily curt phrases into the void. "This is unheard of. This is an upscale community. And where do the guards look? Well, I'll give them hell." Claire did not share her husband's discontent, but thoughtfully reviewed the footage from the surveillance camera of the country house. She and her husband hadn't been there for 2 weeks, and Steve decided to look through the video archive for that period. What was their surprise when a girl of about 10 years old appeared on the monitor. She went into the kitchen and looked in the refrigerator, but when she couldn't find anything better, she took out a jar of strawberry jam, scooped it up, and happily ate a couple of spoonfuls. The uninvited guest decided to explore the house further. She went into the living room, sat in a chair by the fireplace, looked at the family photos in frames, and then she was interested in the home karaoke equipment. The girl was surprisingly quick to figure it out, turned it on and sang in a deep and touching voice some modern new-fashioned song, which had been heard from every radio receiver lately. The new artist moved her arms and head funny in time with the melody. Her disheveled blonde curls bounced and made her look like a dandelion. Suddenly, as if she remembered something, she turned down the music track and loudly pulled into the microphone a beautiful, sad song about her mother's gentle hands and sparkling eyes. Claire listened to those painfully familiar words, penetrating into the depths of memory, retrieving almost forgotten pictures and images from her distant childhood. From the age of 8, Claire had to often run away from home to avoid being caught by her aggressive stepfather. He appeared in the house not so long ago, but immediately zealously began to bring up his stepdaughter. After a couple of shots, he first told the same story about his unbearably hard childhood, how from a young age he had to help his mother and carry the whole household on himself. He ended his drunken speech with the invariable conclusion that today's children and teenagers have a much easier life, and even in such comfortable conditions they want nothing. Stumbling, he dragged the unfortunate girl to the desk and forced her to do her homework, poking her finger into her notebooks and blowing hot booze into her face. Forced to answer for all modern youth, Claire timidly tried to insert that she studied well, and her homework was already done, to which her stepfather launched into new memories that in his time parents were respected and did not dare to contradict them, that for this you could get a belt. From his own speeches he sooner or later became furious, began to bang his fist on the table and smash everything around, which terrified the household. Her mother never crossed her husband, only grabbed her daughter and frightened her into a far corner, trying to become as inconspicuous as possible. For as long as Claire could remember, she had always been the victim. In her previous marriage to her father, the situation had been much the same. The head of the family liked to drink a bottle and occasionally beat his submissive wife. Claire remembers him vaguely, more often his shouting and sobbing mother. Well remembered only his funeral. He was hit by a truck, drunk to the point of semi-consciousness. The little girl was deeply affected by the whole burial ritual, in which she participated for the first time. Dozens of sad people, howling grandmothers, a father with a white face, more like a wax doll, which for some reason was placed in a long box decorated with fresh flowers and lace. Sincerely grieving and sobbing mother, for some reason made him kiss his cold forehead at parting. A year and a half they lived with his mother in peace and quiet, and then came the stepfather. At first, modest gatherings in the kitchen with tea and a shot for the mood quickly turned into drunken scandals, and history repeated itself. Claire could never understand why her mother put up with all this. Maybe her self-esteem was too low. Maybe she just didn't have enough thrills, the presence of drama and tragedy in her life every day. Anyway, her mother tolerated it again, silently waiting, huddled in a secluded place for the storm to pass. Then came out and clapped around the drunken body exhausted from the release of negative emotions, undressed him, and put him to bed. The new husband, in spite of his explosive character, was not involved in violence, but he loved women very much and often fooled around on the side, which was known to everyone around, including his wife. Having got acquainted with a neighbor on the landing, Pam, Claire often sat out the domestic storm in her apartment. She liked the cozy atmosphere created by the woman's kind, loving hands. Everything seemed special here. Lacy, snow-white napkins on the old chest of drawers, embroidered pillowcases on the pillows, cuckoo clock on the wall, tea set with pretty roses. Individually, all these little things were nothing special, but altogether it was a whole world, a house with a capital letter where one wanted to return again and again. The old woman was very kind, and her grandson John lived with her. The boy was almost the same age as Claire, so they became fast friends. John, a quiet, somewhat withdrawn John, told his new friend that until recently he had lived with his mother in another city, but she had fallen ill and died, and his grandmother Pam had taken him in. It was noticeable that the subject was painful to the boy. The impressionable orphan at his very young age had already written poems and even composed songs on them. His grandmother left a guitar from her late husband, and the boy slowly learned to play it. In the evenings they drank tea with Pam's next culinary masterpiece, and John presented them his musical novelties. Claire always remembered these heartwarming gatherings with warmth. Grandma Pam's famous pies emitted a stupefying aroma to several floors of the apartment building. They were either delicate and incredibly lush, ruddy beauties with meat or cabbage, or sandy with apples, cherries, or apricots, decorated with an open-work lattice of marvelous dough, crumbly inside and with a toasted sugar crust outside. The elderly neighbor gladly shared with the girl all the wisdom and secrets of home cooking. With John, they became inseparable, together to school, together back, together homework. And then they went for walks or did their own things. Claire read her favorite books, and John quietly strummed his guitar, composing something new. They never got in each other's way. In the yard and at school they were already called bride and groom, but they considered themselves best friends for life. Perhaps it was this agreement and vow of eternal friendship that kept them from crossing that line. Only once, already at the graduation party, there was a barely perceptible spark between them. John asked the girl to a slow dance. The romanticism of the moment was emphasized by a pleasant melody and a semi-dark hall for celebrations. A glass of champagne erased the boundaries of the rules and allowed the long-born sympathy to break out. The first shy kiss was awkward, and they never remembered it out loud, although each of them secretly found it sweet and pleasant. Then Claire enrolled in the economics department of the institute and moved into a dormitory. She was glad to finally leave her unloved home and go on a free voyage through life. John served in the army and decided to work as a warehouse security guard in a private firm. Pam was getting sick a lot and needed money for treatment. Claire sometimes dropped in for a visit, but less and less often. The new independent student life swirled around her. Her studies were easy, and by the end of the semester she was already the best student of the course. Active and communicative, Claire was elected head teacher. She enjoyed helping others, organizing the learning process and leisure activities. She felt like a butterfly that had finally left its tight cocoon, floating effortlessly in this wonderful world of opportunities and prospects. Two other students lived in the room with her, the serious Sarah and the smashing redhead Lara. All three of them were in the same group and stuck together. Lara was always getting involved. Being the head girl, Claire often had to cover for her and get her out of trouble. She was also disastrously unlucky in love, and because of this, the emotional neighbor fell into depression and stopped studying. Claire rushed to her aid. Dark-haired, statuesque Sarah did not hide her ambitions, and from the first year of study she knew exactly what she wanted from life. She was tough and uncompromising, and looked down on the careless Lara, but she was respectful of Claire and always listened to her opinion. In her second year, she successfully married a solid businessman, but she did not give up her studies and dream of a career. She often said to Claire, "If you need anything, just ask. I will always help you. Your head is in the right place." Student life was booming and did not let her relax. In the third year at the New Year's party, Claire met Steve from the parallel stream. The young man wooed long and beautifully, not trying to force events, which was very much to the girl's liking. Flowers, theaters, exhibitions, romantic evenings in cozy restaurants, all this excited and dizzying Head. It turned out that they not only liked the same music and movies, their life interests also coincided. "This is my man. This is true love," thought Claire, keeping her admiring eyes on Steve. Her heart fluttered in her chest, and her eyes shone with happiness, and it was impossible to hide it from others. Girls envied them, called them an ideal couple, and predicted a long and happy life together. And so it happened. After graduating from the institute, they immediately got married. Steve's parents, not poor people, gave them a gift of a substantial amount of money, which energetic and ambitious newlyweds decided to invest in business and found their own bank. Claire turned for help to Sarah, who by that time already held the position of head of department in a large insurance company and dealt with just bank risks. The influential friend did not deceive expectations, and soon a new bank appeared in the city. Claire liked to work in her specialty, to do what she was easily able to do, to analyze the trends of the modern financial market, intuitively navigating in all the intricacies of this sphere. Day and night she worked on the development and expansion of the business. Her husband was the general director. Teamwork was going well. Everything was going as smoothly as possible. Despite the fact that the spouses were together almost around the clock, their relationship only got better. Claire took her pregnancy with joy. On a wave of euphoria, the happy woman redoubled her efforts, and by the birth they opened 2 more bank branches. In due time was born healthy Andrew and the young mother fully immersed in a new life. John's fate was quite different. He was unexpectedly jailed for a multi-million-dollar theft from a warehouse. There were rumors that he was framed by his superiors, but no proof was ever found. Claire didn't believe that her childhood friend, the kind and naive John, was capable of a crime. She visited her grandmother Pam as much as possible and tried to support her, but she was completely sick from such tragic events. The elderly woman was taken to the hospital with a heart attack. The prognosis of doctors were disappointing. Pam was not long. Former neighbors said that John even tried to negotiate with the head of the zone to let him under escort to say goodbye to his grandmother, but he only laughed at such a request. In despair, despite the fact that the term of imprisonment is almost expired, the guy joined the escape of recidivists, and they succeeded. After a while, they found a corpse in the woods, so disfigured by wild beasts that he was identified only by a patch with John's name on his uniform, and Pam's grandmother died before her grandson arrived. Claire took care of the funeral expenses. Now, already at a conscious age, seeing her loved one off on her last journey, her feelings were quite different from those of her childhood. Tears rolled down her cheeks in large hail, and the lump in her throat made it impossible for her to breathe. For a long time she grieved for Pam. And now the very song that John, her childhood best friend who had died a few years ago, had composed was playing from the computer speakers, performed by a girl she didn't know. Each word warmed her soul and echoed in her mind the fondest memories of her childhood and early adolescence. Quiet evenings together, the dim light of the lampshade, the vow of eternal friendship between a boy and a girl, the awkward but welcome kiss. Claire woke up from her slumber. Angry Steve had already left, either to argue with the guards who had failed to keep an eye on their house, or on work-related matters. He'd been home less and less lately. Claire never came back from her maternity leave to work. First, little Andrew was sick a lot. Then her husband insisted that she should take care of the house, saying that business was not a woman's business. Eventually, he took over the bank. Constantly disappeared. Then at meetings with investors. The wife immensely trusted her husband, although girlfriend Lara always urged, "You cannot, they say, to be so blind." Rarely at home it means that he does not want, probably cheats. She herself, Lara, had seen him with unknown beauties. Claire was uncomfortable with these conversations, and she always found an explanation. Clients usually come to a meeting at the restaurant with their wives and girlfriends, but there was no argument as to why he wasn't taking her along. Claire walked over to the mirror, and for the first time in the last few years, she examined herself critically from the outside. For her 35 years, she looked pretty good. Still a trim figure, not a wrinkle on her face. She still had a lot of young guys looking back at her. True, for household chores gorgeous. Once long blonde hair had to be shortened to a manageable length. They can now be quickly washed and dried, and then tied in a permanent bundle, so as not to interfere with cooking and cleaning. But the eyes, they're not the same. They no longer sparkle with naive directness. They no longer reflect the universe of stars and comets as they did in his youth. Steve used to be crazy about them, but he's changed since then too. Everything's changed. The main thing is that they love each other, that they love their son, Andrew. For more than 13 years, they are still the perfect family for others. They live in wealth. There is a large apartment closer to the city center, a spacious cottage which Claire herself designed and supervised the construction. Almost all weekends the house is full of guests. A merry, noisy company, they fry kebabs, drink good wine, sing karaoke. True, when everyone went away, the husband now sharply changed. senselessly watched everything in a row in the TV or phone. He had little interest in his wife. Claire always found excuses for this behavior and tried not to be intrusive. In fact, a man works hard, supports the whole family. They do not deny themselves almost anything. Do you want a car to go shopping? Please. Want to go to the resort? No problem. You want to hire an assistant to help you around the house? Just say the word. In spite of that, lately some strange feeling deep inside her had not given her any rest, a feeling of something lost, incomplete. Andrew had grown up and become quite independent, his own interests, his own friends. Claire was left with only the everyday household chores. But in the institute she was predicted a great future, and even invited to work abroad in a large financial organization. She missed her profession very much. She wanted to plunge back into the turbulent activity as in her youth. Claire even developed new measures to optimize the work of the bank. But her husband on such conversations only waved his hand. Everything is fine, they say. It will not be better. It works and works. Sometimes it seemed to Claire that she was living some alien, not her own life. Lara on these arguments only loudly indignant. You're stingy, my dear. The vast majority of women cannot even dream of such a fate, and you still lack something. Claire, after thinking about it, agreed and again threw all her efforts into maintaining the image of an ideal life. After breakfast, Steve suddenly announced that he would go to another city for a couple of days to evaluate the collateral property. Such trips were now frequent, and Claire always had a travel bag packed for her husband. Andrew warned her that after school, he would go to a friend's house for a sleepover, probably to play console games late into the night. All the previous day, Claire couldn't stop thinking about the strange incident that the video camera had captured. How had this song, written many years ago, suddenly left the family circle and in some unfathomable way gone viral? Having no more energy to guess, she put on a sweater, jeans, and comfortable sneakers, and drove her faithful friend, a red car, out of town, to the dacha. September was still happy with sunny days, but warned with a cool breath of wind about the impending cold. My mood was excellent, and I had enough energy to move mountains. My favorite radio wave was playing the hits of my early youth in the absence of commercials. The guards at the entrance to the village apologized for the incident, but Claire just waved it away. She was interested in something else. Who's that girl running around here unsupervised? She asked, pulling up beside the guard. They just shrugged. Maybe they didn't know, or maybe they were afraid to provoke the continuation of the story. The chatty neighbor, on the contrary, shared her observations and thoughts. She saw children here a couple of times. Most likely they are from the orphanage, which is 2 kilometers from the village. What luck, so lucky. The neighbor shook her head. Right under the nose of potential criminals live. First they broke into the house, and then what? They'll start robbing? Claire did not react to such nonsense so as not to waste time and went straight to the orphanage. The principal at first argued for a long time, but a decent sum in an envelope left on the table with the words, "This is a charitable donation," softened her tone. She confessed that there was a girl and a couple of boys who always had to be found and then punished for unauthorized walks outside the territory. "Can I talk to this girl?" The woman hesitated a bit, but after about 15 minutes she brought the pupil. The little girl came in and sat shyly on the visitor's couch next to Claire. It was obvious that someone had just tried to curb her curly hair, which had been pulled back into a ponytail and tied up in a huge bow. But the unruly locks still managed to break free and twist in their own way, in keeping with the character of their mistress. The young woman smiled at her and handed her a chocolate bar in a colorful wrapper, bought at a stall on the way. "Hi. My name is Claire. What's yours?" The girl looked wary and scared. She'd just gotten a lot of instruction from her teachers about what to say and what not to say. Half of it she didn't understand at all. "Wendy," she said quietly, and reached out hesitantly for the candy. In spite of all the attempts of the institution to confine her to a limited framework, her bright individuality was still bursting through. Claire liked this lively girl with the devil in her eyes. "Wendy, you sang so beautifully at karaoke at my house last Sunday," she said, looking at the child affectionately. The frightened girl immediately tried to run away, but the woman gently held her back. "Wendy, don't be afraid. I won't do anything bad to you, and I won't complain, I promise you. Just tell me what song you were singing." The girl blushed deeply and tears came to her eyes. "I didn't mean to." I was catching a cat and it jumped into the window. It just happened. I didn't take anything from you." Claire soothed her, trying to cope with the difficult task of earning the trust of a child with a twisted fate. Finally, realizing that she was in no danger, Wendy confusedly told how, at the beginning of the summer, having once again escaped from the orphanage, she and the boys were walking in the woods, and at some point fell behind and got lost. She tried for a long time to get to the road without success. It began to rain and she was soaked to the skin. It was cold and frightened by the loud chirping of birds. The girl sat down on a fallen tree and cried. Here she was found by a kind uncle with a dog. In his hut she was warmed by the hearth. He treated the girl to tea with jam from forest berries and to cheer her up, sang a few songs. She remembered one of them well. And in the evening he took her to the orphanage. The girl's story impressed the young woman and gave her a timid hope. Her heart snapped and her throat instantly became dry. What if it was John? Claire smiled at the girl and touched her soft curls lightly. Wendy suddenly asked seriously, keeping her gaze fixed on her. "Will you come to see me again?" Somewhere deep in her huge gray eyes suddenly reflected the hidden, not childish mental torment, the fear of making a mistake, of running into indifference and being rejected. A lump came to Claire's throat. She hugged the little girl fondly. "I'll be there for sure, I promise you, my good girl." At the edge of the forest they could see the roofs of houses scattered randomly among the trees. When Claire got closer, she saw a dying village. Almost all the houses were boarded up, their shutters burned out by the merciless sun, and their hedges gnarled. Only a few houses looked inhabited. Most of the people who came out to meet the unexpected visitor were old men. All of them survived from the farm. In every courtyard flocks of chickens, goats, and cows could be heard. "We know this hermit, a good man." The inhabitants of the forgotten village answered the questions of a city lady in a new-fashioned car. He often helped us with household chores. Only recently he got sick. He was beaten badly. Now we help him with milk and bread. Claire explained that he might be an old acquaintance she was looking for. A chatty, cheerful old man volunteered to show the young woman the hermit's hut. It was quite a long walk, at least it seemed so. All the way he was talking, reminiscing about his bygone youth. Claire listened half-heartedly, a little uneasy. The deserted terrain was unsettling and frightening. The thicket was beginning to grow thicker, and gullies and fallen trees made it difficult to follow. For a moment the woman even regretted her action, but immediately dismissed the thought. For the sake of her childhood friend, she was ready for anything. A dilapidated house appeared. A small dog came running toward them with a loud bark. Claire stopped, but the old man reassured her. "It's Rex. Don't be afraid. He won't bite." The old man called out loudly, "Hey, son, I've brought you a guest. She is looking for you." The door creaked, and on the threshold, leaning heavily on a lumpy stick, slowly came out a stooped, hunched, not young man. "Rex, come here. Hello," he wheezed. No, Claire thought disappointedly as she looked at him. This is a complete stranger. But it was too late to back out. Maybe he could tell her how he knew the song. Claire approached, trying to get a closer look at the loner. "Hello?" Long, uncut hair with graying at the temples, a tangled beard, wrinkles around his eyes. And his eyes. So familiar, imbued with sadness and sorrow. So familiar. "God, John, John, John," she said, wrapping her arms around his head and pulling him close to her. The man gasped and buried his face in her hair. So they stood there, silently embraced, not believing that it had happened and they had met, after years and through all the terrible events. "You know each other?" The old man was surprised. "It looks like you have a lot to talk about. Go ahead. I'm glad it worked out that way." After saying goodbye to the old man, Claire still couldn't believe the miracle. What had happened? How had he gotten here? John led her into his humble dwelling, boiled an old smoky kettle on a makeshift stove. Rex ran around, delighted at the unexpected guest. The tea of forest herbs and berries was very tasty and fragrant. Warming her hands on the hot iron mug, the woman listened attentively to the story of what had happened to John since he had served his prison sentence. John lay looking up at the dusty gray ceiling. The snoring of his cellmate could be heard on the left, and he could not fall asleep. How did it happen that for more than 6 years he had been looking at the same crack in the whitewash every night? Of course, as they say, you can't be safe from jail and prison, but only a fool could do that. After all, he saw that the boss's "something is not good" affectionate tone and easily given an advance payment for 2 months in advance should have been wary. But the money was so necessary then. Pam's grandmother had gotten sick and the doctors were prescribing a lot of expensive drugs. Yeah, I figured I'd make some money. But it turned out the other way around. He only remembered how he came on shift and drank a cup of coffee late at night to cheer himself up. He woke up only in the morning from the hum of voices, a terrible headache and some bitterness in his mouth. He never returned home again. The investigator endlessly asked the same questions, mockingly forcing him to start the story again. The free lawyer smiled sweetly, assuring him that he would do everything possible to get him released as soon as possible. In the end, John was given the maximum sentence, 7 years in prison. Resentment and despair tormented his soul. Now in the family, no money, no breadwinner, and even more unnecessary anxiety and worry, which only aggravated the course of the illness of the grandmother. Pam could not come to visit, and when her grandson spoke to her for the last time on the phone, she was completely weak. I would like to see her one more time, to hug her and thank her for everything. The camp director wouldn't let her in, and that lawyer was a mess. A slippery guy. I got the impression that he had the task not to acquit the defendant, but on the contrary. Heavy thoughts were swarming in John's head, and he did not notice how deep the night had fallen. A distinct whisper was heard in the corner of the cell. "Everything is ready. We leave tomorrow." John immediately recognized the voice. It was the recidivist Sadoy. He had been acting suspiciously lately. He thought of escape. This is the way out. Without thinking, John quietly stood up and, coming very close, whispered loudly, "I'm with you." The gray-haired man cursed, but there was nothing to be done. He and his accomplice had spent 2 months digging a manhole out of the carpenter's shop, and now the whole operation might be ruined. It was easier to take the third with him. That was the deal. John was nervous, and until the last moment was not sure of the correctness of his spontaneous impulse, but there was no way to retreat. Everything went surprisingly smoothly, and by evening the 3 prisoners were rushing through the forest, ignoring the scratches from the thorny briar bushes that clung to their arms and legs as if trying to keep them from doing anything rash. After a few kilometers, it became clear that they were lost. It began to darken quickly. The autumn cold penetrated the whole body. The gray-haired man walked confidently up to John and angrily hissed in his face, "Take off your robe." He realized that there was no friendship between the fugitives and backed away. The 2 criminals pounced on him and began to beat him furiously, taking out their anger on their accomplice because of unplanned problems and angrily saying, "Don't you understand? Your senior told you to take it off, so take it off." They beat me with everything: hands, feet, and a stick. When the unfortunate man was quiet, they took off his robe with his belongings and went into the darkness. John awoke only at dawn, his body aching badly, especially his back and head. He got up with great difficulty, leaning on a stick that had been used to beat him recently, and walked wherever he could. He walked for a long time. It seemed like an eternity. With difficulty moving his legs, he dragged and dragged forward. He knew that if he relaxed, he would die. On the way, he came across mushrooms and berries. Some he knew, some he ate at random. He slept intermittently, burrowing into thick bushes. Cold and dampness penetrated to the bones. Trees, trees, nothing but trees. Space and time had lost their meaning. John didn't care, even if his mangled legs would lead him back to the camp. Suddenly, a dilapidated hut emerged from the thicket. After making sure that it was uninhabited, the exhausted fugitive collapsed in exhaustion on a makeshift bed covered with a pile of rags and fell into a deep, painful sleep, where his grandmother reached out to him, smiled, and as if saying goodbye to him forever. John opened his eyes and moved. His body responded to the sharp pain in his back. His nose smelled musty and damp, and his mouth was dry. The feeling of thirst gave me strength and drove me to search for water. It had rained a little during the night, but it was enough to fill a dirty aluminum bowl that had been thrown by someone at the entrance long ago. Carefully holding it so as not to stir up the clay that had settled to the bottom, I took a drink and drank the precious drops greedily. It felt a little better. In the daylight, his temporary shelter didn't look much better than it had yesterday. It had been a long time since man had set foot here. It must have once been the home of a handy man. The homemade stove made of stones had not seen a fire for many years, but there was a neat stack of firewood lying nearby. A spoon, bowl, and mug were covered with dust on a shrunken table in the corner. There was a smoldering kerosene lamp. On a small shelf were 2 boxes of damp matches, a packet of salt, and a bag of moldy groats. Among useful things there was a large rusty kitchen knife, a blunted axe, a wok, and an ancient kettle. Not far away in a small ravine there was a spring, covered with stones by someone's caring hands. But the boy was not going to stay here long. Digging through the rags, he took out more or less decent pants and a sweater. He decided not to look too far. The main thing now was to see his grandmother. But how to get to the city? I intuitively chose a direction and resolutely headed forward, leaving just in case markings on the way. In about 40 minutes I came to the edge of the forest, next to the village. He lied to an elderly woman that he was a mushroom hunter, got lost, and barely found the way out. She didn't bother him with questions, because John looked quite peaceful, even touching. She brought him a big mug of steaming milk and a piece of still warm, fragrant bread. Trying not to spill a crumb, the boy poured himself into the breakfast. The kind-hearted woman only shook her head, looking at the hungry mushroom hunter. Her kind look reminded something of grandmother's. "Let me help you with some chores." John wanted to thank the kind hostess. Mary, as she introduced herself later, lived alone, so there was always plenty of work for the men. John chopped firewood for the week ahead and brought her water from the well. The woman was glad of such unexpected help, gave him some money, and showed him how to get to the highway to take a bus to the city. A neighbor timidly peeked out from behind the door. "John, are you there? I'm Aunt Louise. What hospital is Grandma in?" She shrieked and went out onto the landing. "John, Aunt Pam was buried yesterday." "You're too late, dear." His eyes went black and he leaned against the wall to keep from falling. "It's all in vain. Not in time." It was throbbing in his head. "Are you sick? Should I call an ambulance?" the neighbor asked the pale guy. He exhaled and tried to pull himself together. "No, Aunt Louise, don't. I feel better already." "No. Do you have the keys to our apartment?" "Sure. Aunt Pam always left them for me." The empty, lifeless apartment only got worse. Dead silence, not a sound around. The clock on the wall was silent. It seemed that time had stopped here forever. Life had left this once cozy, warm house. John sank into his favorite armchair in exhaustion. What was next? "I can't stay here for long. I won't go back to prison." "What's left?" "You can't run for long without documents." He pondered for a couple more minutes, then found an old rucksack on the mezzanine, quickly threw together some essentials and jumped out of the door. Then he came back for his guitar, the last thread linking him to the past. It was urgent to leave the city. He couldn't stand it, and stopped by the cemetery. He walked along the familiar path along the graves. She and her grandmother used to come here all the time to visit her late mother and grandfather. Pam kept a place here for herself too, and often showed it to her grandson, reminding him where she should be buried. John was always angry with her for such talk and would irritably wave her off. He couldn't imagine that Grandma Pam could suddenly disappear. It seemed she would always be there. There was a fresh grave, covered with a modest wreath of artificial flowers. The cross above it was adorned with the sign Pam. The inscription struck him so deeply that his legs suddenly gave out and he sat down right there, face pressed against the freshly carved wood of the cross. Suddenly came the realization that here ended the earthly journey of the only one in the whole world of a dear person. Never again would he see her kind eyes. Never again would she embrace him tenderly with her warm, wrinkled hands and ask him in a tender voice with a phrase from some old fairy tale, "Why did you hang up your head?" "Forgive me, my dear." Only John, depressed by these sad thoughts, could utter. So he had to go back to the abandoned shack and settle down in a new place. No name, no last name, no past, and no future either. In the warm season he helped the old people in the village. He made hay for the cattle, cut firewood, dug the garden, and patched the roofs. From the old man learned that recently, deep in the woods, 30 kilometers away, they found the corpse of a fugitive criminal devoured by beasts, which could not even be identified, and realized that he got away from his cellmates relatively easily. At first he looked around at every sound and strangers. Everything seemed suspicious to him. It seemed that they were about to come for him. Then he became bolder. He ate what the forest gave him, berries, mushrooms. The old men also paid generously to the irreproachable helper, meat, eggs, milk, and vegetables. Mary offered him a funny puppy with black and red spots from her yard dog. "Take it to keep you busy. It will be a bell for you." The cheerful Rex became a faithful friend for the lonely man. Now in the morning he was awakened by the dog's cheerful barking and rough tongue leaving wet marks on his face. In winter, when the forest turned into a fairy tale snow-covered country and the cabin looked like a huge snowdrift with a chimney on top, John did his favorite thing: composed songs. All his emotions and experiences were poured into ornate lyrics and beautiful melodies. But only Rex and the curious squirrels who sometimes peeked into the warm hut in search of something tasty could hear them. As the years passed, he came to accept his hard fate. Every day no longer seemed like a struggle for survival, but a familiar chore. John hiked farther and farther into the forest, exploring his surroundings. One day, when he heard a suspicious mechanical whirring sound, he came right on top of a group of men methodically sawing out the flattest and most beautiful trees with chainsaws. Realizing that they were black loggers, he tried to escape unnoticed, but failed. They noticed the poorly dressed man with the dog and took him for a homeless man. To teach the curious vagrant a lesson, they caught up with him and muzzled him. The brave Rex tried to fend off his master, but he was kicked in the side and flew off into the nearby bushes with a pitiful squeal. John fell onto his bed, his whimpering dog lying next to him. His body ached unbearably. The next day, Rex was cheerful and galloped around his lying master, urging him on. But John felt worse. His back ached intolerably, and his legs went numb. The hope of lying down and getting back on track was not realized. Only thanks to the restless old man, who sometimes visited the lonely hermit, the man somehow survived. The confession of his childhood friend deeply struck Claire. A feeling of pity and compassion penetrated her soul. Throughout the story, she experienced the events together with him, shivering from the cold in the ravine, languishing from unbearable pain and loneliness. The young woman took his rough palms in her hands and said, looking directly into his eyes, "John, the main thing is that you are alive. I'll come tomorrow with the doctor. Wait for me." His faded gaze came back to life and became for a moment the same as it had been in his youth. "Claire, don't forget that I'm an outlaw," he realized. "And what if he turns me in?" Claire clasped his hands and said firmly, "Everything will be fine. I'll be there tomorrow." When she reached the city, she immediately called a doctor she knew to arrange an on-site consultation, and luckily he agreed. John was very happy about the return of his childhood friend. He stayed up all night, excited by the events of the previous day. The joy of such a pleasant, unexpected meeting and the hope to finally get out of the vicious circle was replaced by the arguments of merciless logic about the unreality of a positive resolution of the situation. After the examination, the doctor took Claire aside and, adjusting his glasses, said, "What I see now is most likely a damaged vertebra in the lumbar thoracic region, resulting in compression of the spinal cord. If not operated on in the next few days, he could be permanently paralyzed." The young woman asked anxiously, "Will you take care of it?" "It's not my specialty. I can give the contacts of my good friend. He is a traumatologist and works in a private clinic. But I warn you, it's not a cheap operation. You may need to replace a vertebrae." Claire got up early to prepare breakfast. She liked to treat her family to Pam's fresh morning baked goods. "I can't eat this inedible pie." Steve grinned, looking disappointed at the still hot pastry. He arrived late at night and Claire tried to ignore the offensive remark. Most likely her husband's irritation had accumulated from his work. At breakfast, she told him about her recent adventures, leaving out some details. Steve, who had listened casually at first, had gotten a look on his face by the end of the story. "Are you crazy?" he rumbled. "What if something had happened to you?" Claire agreed that maybe she had been careless somewhere, but everything had ended well. "You see, Steve, John is a very kind man, a childhood friend, and he needs an operation urgently. I've already arranged it at the hospital. I just need the money to do it, or he's going to stop walking soon. I don't want to be treating homeless people at my own expense. We should go to the police. Maybe he killed someone and is hiding there now." The categorical tone and hard, cold look allowed no objections, It was useless to argue. What to do? We couldn't delay. I called a few friends. As always, they wanted to be friends only in joy. Someone simply refused. Someone said that there were no available funds. She couldn't get a loan from the bank without her husband's consent, so she was left with a high-interest loan. As a financially literate person, she realized how much she would have to overpay for it. I'll pawn the car after all, she thought. The main thing is to get the money quickly. Now every day is on the account. At the credit organization, she only needed a passport. The employees smiled and offered coffee, seeing that the client was solvent. Claire hurried to the car, which she left around the corner in a small alley, clutching the bag with the coveted sum to her chest. As she passed a small restaurant, she stopped at the window. Right in front of her at the table sat her husband Steve and her friend Lara. Without noticing her, they were chirping merrily, hugging and kissing. Claire just stood there, unable to take her eyes off them or move. There he was, the same old Steve, cheerful and attentive, but now not with her. And here was her friend, who had long ago hinted that her husband was in love with someone else, but Claire didn't want to hear it. What next? To pretend that nothing happened and continue to live together in wealth and lies. Suddenly she remembered a similar scene from her childhood, when her unhappy mother with a heavy bag, leading little Claire by the hand, was petrified when she saw her stepfather in a merry company, grabbing some woman, flushed with alcohol, by the soft spot below her back, to which she reacted with approving laughter. Claire waited for her mother to tell her husband, but she remained silent. No, she was not a victim. She did not want to inherit this bitter fate. Claire shook her head vigorously at the thought, and her body broke free of its stupor. The couple behind the glass finally noticed her, and there was no trace of merriment on their faces. Steve was the first to come out of his stupor and belatedly pulled away from Lara, still staring dumbfounded at her friend, unable to move. But Claire had already made up her mind, got into her car, and drove to the hospital. She had other things to worry about. There she arranged for the operation and paid the necessary amount of money to the cashier. Tomorrow morning she must go to pick up John, then take the dog to the cottage and persuade the neighbors to look after and feed him. The joy of helping her old friend overshadowed all the negativity of the unexpected discovery. Claire was surprised at her own calmness. Her mind was suddenly clear. At last, she owned her destiny again. When she returned home, her husband was already waiting for her, determined and ready for a serious conversation. But Claire, anticipating what he might say, did not want to hear her husband's pathetic excuses. "You're early today," she said simply. "Are you going to eat?" Steve's jaw dropped. Quickly regaining his composure, hoping that everything will be resolved by itself, he hurried to answer, "Yes, of course." Andrew hadn't come back from class yet, and they were having lunch together. Calmly, arranging the salad on plates and not looking into the eyes of her husband, Claire said, "I want a divorce as soon as possible." Steve almost choked. "Why? We're fine." "You're doing fine. You're doing fine. I don't want to live like this." The husband decided not to play games. "Everybody lives like this. I won't give you a divorce. I don't want these courts and division. Tell me what you want. I'll buy it for you." She didn't expect such cynicism from her husband. The man sitting across from her became a complete stranger overnight. Claire felt physically disgusted to even be near him. "I can't live under the same roof with you." "Let's part ways," she suggested. "I said it!" he shouted and jumped up from the table. Claire knew from experience that it was useless to continue the conversation. In the evening, she went to her son's room. "Andrew, let's play cities." He knew something was wrong. Since they were kids, they'd play this game when one of them was in a bad mood. "Mom, what's wrong?" She sat down next to him and put her arm around Andrew's shoulders. It was so good that her son felt and understood her like that. She had always been honest with him too, but now it was hard for her to speak. "Andrew, I think your dad and I are getting a divorce." Her son's eyes grew sad, but his face did not betray any emotion. "Mom, don't you think I'm not noticing? I'm not 5 years old. I can see that you're unhappy with him." Claire even shuddered at such an adult and correct phrase of her son. Suddenly he had voiced what she had not dared to admit to herself all these past years. She brushed a traitorous tear from her cheek and hugged her grown-up son tightly. They sat like that for a long time and talked about everything. Claire told about an old friend she had accidentally found, and her son confessed that he liked a girl from the parallel class. When she left the bedroom, the woman knew for sure that she was doing everything right. On the day of the operation, early in the morning, Claire was already at the hospital. Shaved and trimmed, the forest hermit had freshened up and looked like the old John again. He was worried about everything that was happening and tried to find out how much the treatment would cost. But she only joked about it. She said that when you recover, you will write songs for famous singers, then you will pay back the debt. Waiting at the operating room seemed endless. My heart stopped, then began to beat frantically. It was impossible to just sit and wait calmly, and the young woman slowly walked back and forth along the corridor, trying to curb her emotions. Lara had been calling insistently for the third day. Claire gave in and picked up the phone. "Claire," she said in a high-pitched voice, fearing that her friend would hang up before she heard. "I'm sorry, darling. I tried to tell you everything, but Steve forbade me." "So he's Steve now? Well, if you can get him to give me a divorce, then we're even," Claire said to the traitor. She knew for sure that Lara would gnaw her way to happiness with her teeth. Finally, the tired doctor came out and, wiping the sweat from his forehead, smiled. "It's going to be okay now, don't worry." Claire's heart was relieved. A sigh of relief escaped from her chest. Thank you, God. There was one more important thing to do, and she didn't know how to approach it. She hired a lawyer and paid him the last of her money to bring up the criminal case of the criminal who had died during the escape. They met a few days later, and he was shining like a Christmas tree. "I'm glad to tell you, Claire, the case was so badly fabricated that it took me half an hour to figure it out. Besides, there's an examination which proves that the accused had a horse dose of sleeping pills in his blood on the night of the theft. In the light of these facts, it would be easy to acquit him and restore the documents." The woman wanted to kiss in front of everyone, in front of the diligent former operative, who now worked as a private detective. Claire was not mistaken in the abilities of a former friend. The next day, sullen Steve silently handed her a printed settlement agreement and dryly threw, "Read it. Are you satisfied?" According to it, the wife was offered to take his car and half of the amount from their joint bank account, which they had accumulated over a lifetime. All the business would stay with Steve. "Add the cottage and I'll sign right away," she said. She wanted to keep the house she had put her heart and soul into. Steve grumbled. "Have it your way. Take it." He gritted his teeth. The woman hadn't even expected such generosity. She now had enough money to pay off all her debts and live comfortably for several years. Claire had always dreamed of living close to nature, and now she could enjoy the delights of country life. The spacious house, which used to be a country house, breathed warmth and was filled with positive energy and harmony. All the closest people found a place in it. John was on the mend. He was still nervous because of his uselessness, not wanting to be a burden. He took to helping around the house and started looking for a job. Wendy never left his side. Now she became a frequent guest in the house. Every Sunday, Claire took her from the orphanage, determined to adopt the girl. Her cheerful voice echoed through the rooms. Andrew didn't mind all the fun. He was happy to help with the recording equipment, and even edited a few clips of the songs John and Wendy often sang together. The restless Rex would run around the property with the kids during the day, and in the evening he would choose a spot close to his owner and listen to him play his favorite instrument. Claire also sat down nearby, listening to the music with pleasure. It gave her a state of some inexpressible feeling of peace, security, happiness. The melody awakened that childhood love, which seemed long dead, left only a bright memory. But it was alive, just slept all these years, and now woke up, bound the couple with unbreakable ties. Now all together they gathered around the fireplace, which was inviting with its warmth and created a special atmosphere. It was so peaceful and good to sit with a cup of tea and a piece of delicious cake, lovingly prepared by Claire, to chat and laugh at the artistic antics of the mischievous Wendy. A couple of months later, Sarah suddenly called. "Hello, friend. Did you know your husband's in trouble at the bank? He's having trouble making his loan payments." "He's not my husband anymore," the woman replied briefly. After hearing the latest news about Claire's life, Sarah exclaimed firmly, "Well, that makes sense. He got together with Lara, you say? If you're out of business, I'm not going to help them anymore. It's useless anyway. Two stupid financiers for one bank is too much. She laughed. After another month, the bank went bankrupt. Claire felt sorry for her child, but now it was not her concern. Sarah called again, now with a concrete proposal. Her longtime friend wanted to do something to help. Claire, the government took the bank away from your husband and they're putting it up for sale. I can help you with the loan. You can get him back. You've got to take matters into your own hands. You're not a housewife with your head. It didn't take long to convince Claire. Thank you, Sarah. I missed my job. She hung up the phone and rushed down the stairs, eager to share her joy with her loved ones. In the living room, a bewildered John sat in front of his laptop, while a disheveled Wendy galloped around him with a happy squeal, dancing some mysterious savage dance. Rex was barking across the room, excited by the general merriment. Andrew was sitting there smiling. Imagine, he said to his mom. Uncle John put Wendy's songs on the internet with almost 1 million hits and a producer's offer came in. I'm a banker now, Claire laughed. The general cheering was her response. Wendy rounded her eyes. Mom, you're going to collect cans now? Everyone burst out laughing. This is the perfect life, she thought. When your family is happy and everyone has something they love to do.